The Story of the Middle Ages, Chapter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. The Story of the Middle Ages by Samuel B. Harding. Chapter 7. Franks and Mohammedans. While the descendants of Clovis were struggling with one another for his kingdom, and while the Church was gaining in wealth and power, a danger was arising in the East that was to threaten both with ruin. This danger was caused by the rise of a new religion among the Arabs. Arabia is a desert land for the most part, and the people gained their living by wandering with their camels and herds from oasis to oasis, or else by carrying on trade between India and the West, by means of caravans across the deserts. The people themselves were like grown-up children in many ways. They had poetic minds, impulsive and generous hearts, but they were ignorant and superstitious, and often very cruel. Up to this time they had never been united under one government, nor had they all believed in the same religion. Some tribes worshipped the stars of heaven, others worshipped fetishes of sticks and stones, and others believed in gods or demons called genii. If you have read the story of Aladdin and his wonderful lamp in the Arabian Nights, you will know what the genii were like. Arabia is so near Palestine that it will not surprise you to hear that the Arabs had also learned something of the religion of the Jews and of the Christians. But until the 7th century after Christ, the Arabs remained, in spite of this, a rude and idolatrous people, without any faith or government which all acknowledged. In the 7th century came a change. The Arabs then became a united people under one government and with one religion. And under the influence of this religion they came out from their deserts and conquered vast empires to the east and to the west, until it seemed as though the whole of the known world was to pass into their hands. The man who brought about this change was named Mohammed. He belonged to a powerful tribe among the Arabs, but his father and mother had died before he was 6 years of age. He was then taken care of by his uncle, who was so poor that Mohammed was obliged to hire out as a shepherd boy, and do work that was usually done by slaves. When he was 13 years old, his uncle took him with a caravan to Damascus and other towns of Syria, and there the boy caught his first glimpses of the outside world. When he grew up he became manager for a wealthy widow who had many camels and sent out many caravans, and at last he won her love and respect, and she became his wife. When Mohammed established his new religion she became his first convert, and to the day of her death she was his most faithful friend and follower. Mohammed had a dreamy and imaginative nature, and when he had become a man he thought much about religion. Every year he would go alone into the mountains near his home, and spend a month in fasting and prayer. At times he fell into a trance, and when he was restored he would tell of wonderful visions that his soul had seen, while his body lay motionless on the earth. When Mohammed was 40 years old, a vision came to him of a mighty figure that called him by name, and held an open book before him, saying, "Read." Mohammed believed that this was the angel Gabriel, who came to him that he might establish a new religion, whose watchword should be, "There is but one God, and Mohammed is his prophet." When he began to preach the new faith, Mohammed found few converts at first. At the end of 3 years he had only 40 followers. His teachings angered those who had charge of the idols of the old religions, and Mohammed was obliged at last to flee from the holy city of Mecca. This was in the year 622 A.D., and to this day the followers of Mohammed count time from this date, as we do from the birth of Christ. After this Mohammed gained followers more rapidly, and he began to preach that the new religion must be spread by the sword. Warriors now came flocking into his camp from all directions. Within 10 years after the flight from Mecca, all the tribes of Arabia had become his followers, and the idols had everywhere been broken to pieces. Then the Mohammedans turned to other nations, and everywhere they demanded that the people should believe in Mohammed or pay tribute. If these demands were refused, they were put to death. Mohammed could neither read nor write, but his sayings were written down by his companions. In this way a whole chestful of the sayings of the Prophet was preserved, written on scraps of paper or parchment, on dried palm leaves, and even on the broad, flat shoulder bones of sheep. After Mohammed's death, these sayings were gathered together and formed into a book. In this way arose the Koran, which is the Bible of the Mohammedans. Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Jesus were all recognized as prophets in the Koran, but Mohammed is regarded as the latest and greatest of all. The Koran teaches that those who believe in Mohammed and live just lives shall enter paradise when they die. They will there dwell in beautiful gardens where they shall never be burned by the rays of the sun, nor chilled by wintry winds, and there under flowering trees they shall recline forever, clad in silks and brocades, and fed by delicious fruits, which beautiful black-eyed maidens bring to them. To win paradise the Mohammedan must follow certain rules. 5 times a day he must pray with his face turned in the direction of the holy city Mecca. He must not gamble or drink wine, and during the holy month, when Mohammed fasted, he too must fast and pray. But the surest way to gain paradise and all its joys was to die in battle fighting for the Mohammedan faith. This teaching helps to explain why the Christians found the Mohammedans such fierce and reckless fighters. Within 100 years after the death of Mohammed, his followers had won an empire which stretched from the Himalayan mountains to the Red Sea, and from the Red Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. All of southwestern Asia and all of northern Africa were under their rule, and they were preparing to add Spain also, and perhaps all Europe, to the lands where the call to prayer was chanted. In the year 711 A.D., a Mohammedan general named Tariq led the first army of Moors and Arabs across from Africa to Spain. Near where he landed was a huge mountain of rock on which he built a fortress or castle, and from this name it is still called Jibul Tariq, or Gibraltar, the mountain of Tariq. Spain at this time was ruled by the West Goths, but they were weakened by quarrels and idleness, and were not able to resist the fierce Moors. Near a little river in southern Spain the great battle was fought. For 7 days the Christian Goths, under their king Rodrigo, fought against the Mohammedan army, but still the battle was undecided. On the 8th day the Christians fled from the field, and Spain was left in the hands of the Mohammedans. Long after that day an old Spanish poet sang of that battle in words like these: "The hosts of Don Rodrigo were scattered in dismay, when lost was the 8th battle, nor heart nor hope had they. He, when he saw that field was lost and all his hope was flown, he turned him from his flying host, and took his way alone. All stained and strewed with dust and blood, like to some smouldering brand, plucked from the flame Rodrigo showed, his sword was in his hand. But it was hacked into a saw of dark and purple tint, his jewelled mail had many a flaw, his helmet many a dint. He climbed into a hill-top, the highest he could see, thence all about of that wide rout his last long look took he. He saw his royal banners, where they lay drenched and torn, he heard the cry of victory, the Arabs' shout of scorn. He looked for the brave captains that led the hosts of Spain, but all were fled except the dead, and who could count the slain? Where'er his eye could wander, all bloody was the plain, and while thus he said, the tears he shed ran down his cheeks like rain. Last night I was the King of Spain, to-day no king am I. Last night fair castles held my train, to-night where shall I lie? Last night 100 pages did serve me on the knee, to-night not one I call my own, not one pertains to me." This battle destroyed the power of the West Goths. It also marks the beginning of the rule of the Moors in Spain, which was to last until the time of Queen Isabella and Columbus. The ease with which the Moors conquered Spain made them think it would be an easy thing to conquer Gaul also. So within a few years we find their armies crossing the Pyrenees to carry war into that land. But here they met the Franks, and that people was not so easy to overcome as the Goths had been. You have already seen how Clovis built up a strong kingdom in Gaul and Germany, and then how the power slipped away from the hands of his descendants until they became mere do-nothing kings. The real power was now in the hands of the great nobles who acted as the king's ministers. The chief of these was called the Mayor of the Palace, and at the time when the Moors came into Spain, this office was handed down from father to son in a powerful family, which possessed rich estates in the Rhine valley, and could command a multitude of warlike followers. 3 years after the Moors had crossed over into Spain, the old mayor of the palace died, and the office passed to his son Charles. This was a serious time for the kingdom of the Franks. Civil wars now broke out anew among the nobles. The Saxons from Germany broke into the kingdom from the north, and the Moors were pressing up from Spain into the very heart of France. The young mayor of the palace, however, proved equal to the occasion. The civil wars were brought to an end, and all the Frankish lands were brought under his rule. The heathen Saxons were driven back to their own country. Then, gathering an army from the whole kingdom, Charles marched, in the year 732, into southern France to meet the Moors. He found their army near the city of Tours, laden with the booty which they had taken. The Moors expected another victory as great as the one which had given them in Spain, but they found their match in Charles and his Franks. All day long the battle raged. 20 times the light-armed Moors, on their fleet horses, dashed into the ranks of the heavy-armed Franks, but each time Charles and his men stood firm, like a wall, and the enemy had to retreat. At last the Moors gave up the attempt, and when day dawned next morning, the Franks found that they had slipped off in the night, leaving behind them their tents and all their rich booty. This battle forever put an end to the conquests of the Moors in France. It was this battle also, perhaps, that gave Charles his second name, Martel, or the Hammer. For, as an old writer tells us, like a hammer breaks and dashes to pieces iron and steel, so Charles broke and dashed to pieces his enemies. At all events, the fame which Charles Martel won by his actions, and the ability which he showed as a ruler, enabled him to leave his power to his 2 sons when he died. Again there was a war between the mayors of the palace and the nobles who ruled over portions of the kingdom, but again the mayors of the palace won. Then, when quiet was restored once more, the elder of the 2 sons of Charles gave over his power to his brother Pippen, and entered a monastery, in order that he might spend the rest of his years in the holy life of a monk. This left Pippin as the sole mayor of the palace. There was still a Merovingian prince, who sat on the throne, but he was a do-nothing king, as so many had been before him, and he only said the words that he was told, and did the things that were given him to do. Of course this could not go on forever. Everyone was getting tired of it, and at last Pippin felt that the time had come when he might safely take the title of king. First, messengers were sent to the Pope to ask his opinion. The Pope was now eager to get the aid of the Franks against the Lombards in Italy, so he answered in the way that he knew would please Pippin. "It is better," he said, "to give the title king to the person who actually has the power." Then the weak Merovingian king was put off the throne and shut out of sight in a monastery, and Pippin was anointed with the sacred oil and crowned king in his place. As long as he lived, he ruled as a strong and just king. When he died, the crown went to his children, and after them to his children's children. In this way the crown of the Franks continued in the family of Pippin for more than 200 years. End of chapter 7. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 21st, 2007, in Oceanside, California. Story of the Middle Ages, Chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. The Story of the Middle Ages by Samuel B. Harding, Chapter 8, Charlemagne. Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, became king of the Franks when his father Pippin died. He was the greatest ruler of his time, and for hundreds of years after his death his influence continued to be felt in Western Europe. If Columbus had never been born, America would have been discovered just the same, and if Luther had never lived, there would nevertheless have been a Reformation in the Church. But if Charlemagne had never been king of the Franks, and made himself emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, as we shall see that he did, the whole history of the Middle Ages would have been very different from what it actually was. At first Charlemagne's brother ruled with him as king, but within 3 years the brother died, and then Charlemagne ruled as sole king of the Franks. He owed the power which he had largely to his father and to his grandfather, Charles Martel, but Charlemagne used his power wisely and well, and greatly increased it. He put down the rebellions of the people who rose against the rule of the Franks. He defended the land against the Mohammedans of Spain and the heathen Germans of the north. He conquered new lands and new peoples. In addition, he set up an improved system of government, and he did all that he could to encourage learning and make his people more civilized than they had been before. When we read of all the things that Charlemagne did, we wonder that he was able to do so much. In the 46 years that he was king, he sent out more than 50 expeditions against different enemies, and in more than half of these he took the command himself. Charlemagne's wars, however, were not simply for plunder or for more land, as so many of the earlier wars of the Franks had been. They were fought either to keep down the peoples whom the Franks had already conquered, or else to keep out new peoples who were seeking to conquer the Franks. In both of these objects Charlemagne was successful. The net result of his wars was that almost all those lands which had formerly been under the emperors of the West were now brought under the rule of the king of the Franks, and the peoples who lived in these lands, both the old inhabitants and the German newcomers, were allowed peaceably to live together and work out their own destiny. The most stubborn enemy that Charlemagne had to fight was the Saxons. A portion of this people had settled in the island of Britain about 300 years before, but many Saxon tribes still dwelt in the northern part of Germany. In Charlemagne's time they still worshipped Woden and Thor, and lived in much the same way that the Germans had done before the great migrations. It was part of Charlemagne's plan to make himself ruler of all the German nations. Besides, there were constant quarrels along the border between the Saxons and the Franks. The result was that war was declared, and Charlemagne started out to conquer, to Christianize, and to civilize these heathen kinsmen. But it was a hard task, and the war lasted many years before it was ended. Again and again the Franks would march into the Saxon lands in summer and conquer the Saxon villages, but as soon as they withdrew for the winter the young warriors of the Saxons would come out from the swamps and forests to which they had retreated, and next year the work would have to be done over again. After this had occurred several times, Charlemagne determined to make a terrible example. 4,500 of the Saxon warriors who had rebelled and been captured were put to death by his orders, all in one day. This dreadful massacre was the worst thing that Charlemagne ever did, and it did not even succeed in terrifying the Saxons. Instead, it led to the hardest and bloodiest war of all, in which a chief named Widukind led on his countrymen to take vengeance for their murdered relatives and friends. But in the end Charlemagne and his Franks proved too strong for the Saxons. Widukind, at last, was obliged to surrender and be baptized with all his followers. After that the resistance of the Saxons died away, and Charlemagne's treatment of the land was so wise that it became one of the strongest and most important parts of the kingdom. Charlemagne also fought a number of times against the Arabs in Spain. He not only prevented them from settling in southern France, as they had tried to do in the time of Charles Martel, but he won from them a strip of their own country south of the Pyrenees Mountains. In one of these wars the rear guard of Charlemagne's army was cut off and slain by the mountain tribes in the narrow pass of Roncesvalles. The leader of the Franks was Roland, while the leader of the enemy was called Bernardo. Long after that day, strange stories grew up and poets sang of the brave deeds of Roland and of the mighty blasts which he gave on his hunting horn to warn Charlemagne of the danger to his army. 3 blasts he blew, each so loud and terrible that the birds fell dead from the trees, and the enemy drew back in alarm. Charlemagne, many miles away, heard the call and hastened to the rescue, but he came too late. An old song says, "The day of Roncesvalles was a dismal day for you, ye men of France, for there the lance of King Charles was broke in two. Ye well may curse that rueful field, for many a noble peer in fray or fight the dust did bite beneath Bernardo's spear." In most of his wars Charlemagne was successful, and the stories about him told rather of his glory and his might than of his defeats. One of his most important conquests was that of the Lombards in northern Italy. Nearly a century afterward an old monk wrote the story of this war as he had heard it from his father. Desiderius, the king of the Lombards, had offended the Pope, and the Pope appealed to Charlemagne for aid. When Charlemagne marched his army over the Alps into Italy, the Lombard king shut himself up in his capital, Pavia. There he had with him, according to the story, one of Charlemagne's nobles named Otker, who had offended the dread king and fled from him. "Now when they heard of the approach of the terrible Charles," writes this old monk, "they climbed up into a high tower, whence they could see in all directions. When the advance guard appeared, Desiderius said to Otker, 'Is Charles with this great army, do you think?' And he answered, 'Not yet.' When he saw the main army gathered from the whole broad empire, Desiderius said with confidence, 'Surely the victorious Charles is with these troops.' But Otker answered, 'Not yet, not yet.' Then Desiderius began to be troubled and said, 'What shall we do if still more come with him?' Otker answered, 'You will soon see how he will come, but what will become of us I know not.' And behold, while they were speaking, appeared the servants of Charles's household, a never-resting multitude. 'That is Charles,' said the terrified Desiderius. But Otker said, 'Not yet, not yet.' Then appeared the bishops and the abbots and the chaplains with their companions. When he beheld these, the Lombard prince, dazed with fear and longing for death, stammered out these words, 'Let us go down and hide in the earth before the wrath of so terrible an enemy.' But Otker, who in better times had known well the power and the arms of the great Charles, answered, 'When you see a harvest of steel waving in the fields, and the rivers dashing steel-black waves against the city walls, then you may believe Charles is coming.' Scarcely had he spoken when there appeared in the north and west a dark cloud, as it were, which wrapped the clear day in most dreadful shadow. But as it drew nearer there flashed upon the besieged from the gleaming weapons a day that was more terrible for them than any night. Then they saw him, Charles, the man of steel, his arms covered with plates of steel, his iron breast and his broad shoulders protected by steel armor. His left hand carried aloft the iron lance, for his right was always ready for the victorious sword. His thighs, which others leave uncovered in order more easily to mount their horses, were covered on the outside with iron scales. The leg pieces of steel were common to the whole army. His shield was all of steel, and his horse was iron in color and in spirit. This armor all who rode before him, by his side, or who followed him, in fact the whole army, had tried to imitate as closely as possible. Steel filled the fields and roads. The rays of the sun were reflected from gleaming steel. The people, paralyzed by fear, did homage to the bristling steel. The fear of the steel pierced down deep into the earth. "Alas, the steel! Alas, the steel!" cried the inhabitants confusedly. The mighty walls trembled before the steel, and the courage of youths fled before the steel of the aged. And all this, which I have told with all too many words, the truthful seer Otker saw with one swift look, and said to Desiderius, "There you have Charles, whom you have so long desired." And with these words he fell to the ground like one dead. In this war Charlemagne was completely victorious. Desiderius ceased to be the king of the Lombards, and Charlemagne became king in his place. For centuries after that Charlemagne's successors continued to wear the Iron Crown of Italy, which the great king of the Franks had won from Desiderius. One of the results of the conquest of the Lombards was that Charlemagne was brought into closer relations with the Pope. The Emperor of the East still claimed to rule over Italy, but his rule was feeble, and only a small part of the peninsula was now in the hands of his officers. The real power in Italy had passed into the hands of the King of the Franks, and the question now was, whether the Pope should be under his rule as he had been under that of the Eastern emperors. Two things made this question harder to decide. One was that Charlemagne, following the example of his father Pippen, had given to the Pope a large number of the cities and villages which he had conquered in Italy. The other was that the Pope, on Christmas Day of the year 800, placed a crown on Charlemagne's head as he knelt in prayer in St. Peter's Church at Rome, and proclaimed him emperor. These two things helped to make it very hard to decide just what powers the Pope and the King of the Franks should each have. When Charlemagne gave those cities and villages to the Pope, did it mean that he gave up the right to rule there, and turned the power over to the Pope, so that the latter became the prince in these places? And when the Pope crowned Charlemagne as emperor, did that mean that the Pope could not set up and pull down emperors whenever he wanted to? These, you see, are very hard questions to answer, but they are very important questions to understand. Upon the answers given to them would depend the decision whether the Pope was above the emperor, or the emperor above the Pope, and this was a question about which men fought for hundreds of years. We may also ask, what was this empire of which Charlemagne became emperor on that Christmas morning? The name which men give to it is the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. They thought of it as a revival of the old Roman Empire of the East, which had come to an end more than 300 years before. They called it the Holy Roman Empire to show how great a part the Church, and especially the Pope, played in it, and they added the words "of the German nation" because it was the new and vigorous peoples who had come from the north who now supplied its strength. Though Charlemagne as emperor ruled only over the peoples who had obeyed him as king, still men felt that his position now was higher, and his authority greater than it had been before. For now his power was linked with the majestic history of Rome, and was given a more solemn sanction by the Church. In this way the crowning of Charlemagne as emperor was an event of very great importance. For 1,000 years after that day, the office of emperor in the West continued to exist, and for a good part of this time it was one of the most powerful means of holding peoples of Western Europe together in one family of nations, and preventing them from growing wholly unlike and hostile to one another. We may truly say that a new age commences in Europe when force alone no longer rules, and when great ideas, such as the idea of the Church and of the Empire, begin to play a part amid the strife of nations. To govern the wide territories which were under his rule, Charlemagne kept up the counts, or local rulers that he found established in different parts of his empire. Over these he set higher rulers, who were to travel about the country seeing everything and reporting everything to the king. Twice a year, in the spring and in the autumn, the nobles of the land were called together to consult with him and assist him in making laws for the kingdom. These assemblies would continue for several days, according to the importance of the business. While they lasted, messengers would come and go from the king's palace, proposing laws to the assembly and carrying back answers, and no stranger might approach until the business was completed. If the weather was fine, the assembly met in the open air, but if it was not, then the meetings took place in churches and other buildings. The king, meanwhile, was busy receiving presents, talking with the most important men, especially those who dwelt at a distance from his court, and hearing what his nobles and officials had to report to him concerning any part of the kingdom. This last Charlemagne considered very important. As an old writer says, "The king wished to know whether, in any part or any corner of the kingdom, the people murmured or were troubled, and what was the cause of their troubles." Also he wished to know if any of the conquered peoples thought of rebelling, or if any of those who were still independent threatened the kingdom with an attack. And upon all these matters, wherever a danger or a disturbance arose, his chief questions were concerned with its motives or its cause. Besides being a great warrior and a great ruler, Charlemagne was also a great friend of learning and education. He loved to gather about him learned men from all parts of the world. In this palace school, as it was called, the king and his wise men discussed learned questions. Charlemagne himself learned to read only after he was a grown man, and in spite of all his efforts he never succeeded in learning to write. This made him all the more anxious that the bright lads of his kingdom should have the advantages which he lacked. So he founded schools in the monasteries and bishoprics. In this way he hoped to get learned men for offices in the church and state. The rude fighting men of that day, however, looked upon learning with contempt, and many noble youths in the schools neglected their books for hawking and warlike exercises. The old monk who tells us how Charles overcame King Desiderius also tells us of the emperor's wrath when he found the boys of one school going on in this fashion. The boys of low and middle station had been faithful, and when they presented their compositions and poems to the king, he said, "Many thanks, my sons, that you have taken such pains to carry out my orders to the best of your ability. Try now to do better still, and I will give you as reward splendid bishoprics, and make you rulers over monasteries, and you shall be highly honored in my sight." But to the high-born boys, who had played while the others worked, he cried out in wrath, "You sons of princes, you pretty and dainty little gentlemen who count upon your birth and your wealth, you have disregarded my orders and your own reputations. You have neglected your studies, and spent your time in games and idleness or in foolish occupations. I care little for your noble birth and your pretty looks, though others think them so fine. And let me promise you this, if you do not make haste to recover what you have lost by your neglect, you need never think to get any favors from Charles." In many other ways, besides those which we have mentioned, Charlemagne did a great work for the peoples over whom he ruled, and laid the foundations on which the ages that came after builded. In the troubled times that followed his death much of his work seemed to be swept away, but this was only in seeming, for the most important parts of it lived, and still live, in the governments and civilization of the world. Before taking leave of this great king, perhaps you would like to know what he looked like and how he lived. One of the learned men of his court has left a good description of him. "He was tall and stoutly built," he says, "his height being just 7 times the length of his own foot. His head was round, his eyes large and lively, his nose somewhat above the common size, and his expression bright and cheerful. Whether he stood or sat, his form was full of dignity, for the good proportion and grace of his body prevented the observer from noticing that his neck was rather short, and his person rather too fleshy. He was very active," this same writer tells us, "and delighted in riding and hunting, and was skilled in swimming. It was, indeed, because of its natural warm baths that he made his favorite residence and capital at Aachen, the Frank Aix-la-Chapelle. He always wore the Frankish dress, but on days of state he added to this an embroidered cloak and jeweled crown, and carried a sword with a jeweled hilt. The name, Charlemagne, by which we know him, is French, but the king himself, in speech, dress, and habits, was a thoroughly German king, and ruled over a thoroughly German people." End of chapter 8. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 21st, 2007, in Oceanside, California. The Story of the Middle Ages, Chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. The Story of the Middle Ages by Samuel B. Harding, Chapter 9. The Growth of Feudalism. Upon the death of Charlemagne, his empire passed to his son Louis. This ruler is sometimes called Louis the Pious because he was so friendly to the church, and sometimes Louis the Good-natured because he was so easy-going and allowed himself to be guided by his wife and his favorites. Under his rule, the empire lost much of the strength that it had possessed under Charlemagne, and after Louis's death it was still further weakened. His sons had begun fighting for the kingdom even while their father lived. After his death they fought a great battle in which troops of all the Frankish lands took part. The old writers describe this as a terrible struggle, more terrible than any since Attila and his Huns were driven back by the Romans and the Goths, or the Moors were defeated by Charles Martel. Those battles had been fought by the Christians against peoples who were not Christians, but now Christians fought against Christians, Franks against Franks. "May the day of that battle be accursed," wrote a writer who himself took part in the struggle. "May it never more be counted among the days of the year, but be wiped out from all remembrance. May it lack the light of the sun, and have neither dawning nor twilight. May that night also be accursed, that terrible night in which so many brave and skillful warriors met their deaths. Never was there a worse slaughter. Men fell in lakes of blood, and the garments of the dead whitened the whole field." As a result of this battle, the three sons of Louis agreed to divide the kingdom among them. Charles, the youngest son, got the western part, and this in course of time grew into the kingdom of France. Ludwig, the second son, got the land lying east and north of the Rhine River and Alps mountains, and this region in time became the kingdom of Germany. Lothair, the eldest son, got Italy, and a long narrow strip which lay between Charles's portion on the west and Ludwig's portion on the east, and with it he received the title of emperor. This middle strip was long and awkwardly shaped, and there was so little to bind the people together that it never grew into a permanent kingdom. Before many years had gone by, it passed into the hands of the rulers of France and Germany, and the only thing that remained to show its former rule was the name Lotharingia, or Lorraine, which is still given to the northern part of it. This division of the kingdom tended, of course, to make the Frankish power weaker. Other things, too, contributed to this end. The Carolingian princes, as the descendants of Charles are called, were not nearly as strong rulers as their grandfather had been. New enemies, moreover, had now arisen to trouble the land, and make the task of governing it more difficult. The Moors of Spain and Africa were going far into the heart of France and Italy in their search for plunder and slaves. On the north and west, fleets of Viking ships, laden with fierce Northmen from Denmark and Norway, were landing upon the coast, or ascending in their light vessels far up the rivers, plundering, killing, and burning. And from the east the Hungarians, a new race, of close kin to the old Huns, were now advancing year after year up the Danube valley, into Germany, into Italy, into France, carrying everywhere terror and dismay. Since the kings of this period were too weak to protect the land against attack, the people were obliged to look after their own defense. The result was that rich and powerful landowners began to build great gloomy towers and castles as a protection against these raids. In course of time, every lofty hilltop, every cliff, every island in the great rivers came to have a castle, where the lord and his followers might find protection against their enemies. There was now no power in the state either to protect or to punish its subjects, so these lords not only used their castles as a defence against the Hungarians and other enemies, but often themselves oppressed their neighbours. From their strongholds they would sally forth to misuse the peasants of the country around, or to plunder merchants travelling from town to town. Everything was fallen into confusion, and it seemed as if the time told of in the Bible, when every man did that which seemed good in his own eyes, had again come upon earth. There seemed to be only one remedy against these evils for the ordinary freeman. This was to give up his independence and get the lord of some castle to agree to protect him against all other enemies. That, in fact, is just what we find going on in this period. Men everywhere were giving up their independence and becoming dependents of some great man who took them under his protection. When a free man wished to commend himself, as it was called, to the protection of a lord, he went down on his knees before him, put his hands between the hands of the lord, and swore to be his man, that is, to serve him. Then the lord raised his vassal, as the man was thenceforth called, and gave him the kiss of peace. This was called doing homage to the lord. Next the vassal swore to be faithful to his lord in all things. This was the oath of fealty. If the man had land in his own right, he usually gave it up to the lord, and the lord then gave him back the use of it. If he had no land before, the lord granted him the use of some of his own land, and a lance or a twig was given him at the time he did homage, in sign of this. Thenceforth the lord was the real owner of the land, but the vassal had the use of it till his death. When he died, his son would do homage and swear fealty to the lord, and then he would be given the land his father held. Such a piece of land was called a benefice, or a fief, and the name which is given to the whole system was feudalism, or the feudal system. As a result of this system, the ordinary freemen gained the protection which they so much needed, and the state could no longer furnish. Thenceforth they had a place of refuge in the lord's castle to which they could flee when robber bands appeared, and they also had a powerful protector to defend them against the attacks of other lords. But, you may ask, what good was all this to the lord of the castle? Why was he willing to admit these men to become his vassals, and even grant them parts of his own lands as benefices? That is a question which is easily answered. The lord needed men to help him guard his castle and fight his battles, and that was what the vassals supplied. Every year they might be called upon to serve their lord as armored knights for 40 days in the field, besides rendering him other services. In this way the lord obtained military followers, who were closely bound to him by ties of homage and fealty, and the more vassals he had, the more powerful he became. The lords themselves, in turn, often became the vassals of some greater lord above them, and bound themselves to bring all of their followers to serve him, when called upon to do so. In the completed system, the king of the land stood at the head. Then under him were his vassals, and under them were their vassals, and so on until we come down to the peasants. They were not looked upon as worthy to be the vassals of anybody. They were called serfs or villeins, and had to till the soil and raise the food which supported all the classes above them. From what you have been told, you might think that feudalism was an organization only for fighting, but it was something more than this. It came to be an organization for governing the land as well. The power of the kings became so weak that the feudal nobles were able finally to take into their own hands most things that the head of the state ought to have done. In this way it came about that the feudal lords had the right to make war, coin money, make laws, and hold courts in their fiefs. Sometimes they had their own gallows on which to hang offenders. The power that ought to have been in the hands of the head of the state was thus split up into many bits, and each of these great lords had part of it. The growth of the feudal system was going on everywhere in Western Europe from about the 8th to the 11th centuries. It grew slowly, but it grew surely, for in the weakened condition of the state it was the form of organization that best met the needs of the people. So everywhere, in Spain, in France, in England, in Germany, and in Italy, we find the feudal castles arising, and men everywhere gave up their free land, received it back as fiefs, and became the vassals of lords above them. The existence of feudalism is one of the most important facts about the Middle Ages. It is this which makes the government of that period so different from the governments of Greece and Rome, and also from the governments of today. Feudalism, moreover, led to other important changes. In the Church it made the abbots and bishops the vassals of the kings and nobles for the land which the Church held. And since vassals owed military service, the bishops and abbots often became more like feudal warriors than mild and holy servants of Christ. Because the chief business of vassals and lords was fighting, much attention was paid to arms and armor, and to training for war. In this way arose the wonderful coats of mail and suits of armor of the Middle Ages. In this way also arose the long training which one had to go through to become a knight, and the exciting tournaments in which the knights tried their skill against one another. In another chapter is an account of the life of the castle. We tell you of these things here only that you may see how truly we may say of this period that it was indeed the feudal age, as it is sometimes called. Especially is this true of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. It is in those centuries preeminently that we find feudalism grown into a complete system, and ruling the whole life of the lands which the German conquerors had won from the Roman Empire. End of chapter 9. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 24th, 2007, in Oceanside, California. The Story of the Middle Ages, Chapter 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. The Story of the Middle Ages by Samuel B. Harding. Chapter 10. Deeds of the Northmen. One of the things which helped the growth of feudalism was the coming of the Northmen into southern Europe. The Northmen were a sturdy people who dwelt about the Baltic Sea, in the lands which their descendants, the Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes, still occupy. There they had dwelt as long as we have any record of them. While the other Germans were seeking new homes in the 5th and 6th centuries, the Northmen had remained quietly at home, worshipping the old gods, and gaining a scanty living from their herds and fields and from the sea. They were so far away from Rome that only faint reports reached them of the stirring events that were taking place in the Roman lands. For 400 years after the Goths had crossed the frontier, the Northmen remained quiet. But at last Charlemagne's conquest of the Saxons brought Christianity and the Frankish rule close to their doors. Traders and missionaries now began to come among them. From them they learned of the rich and beautiful lands which lay to the south, and their minds were dazzled by the thought of the easy victories which were to be won there. When finally the Northmen came into the southern lands, they came not by land, as the earlier invaders had done, but by sea. The rocky islands, the bold cliffs, and the narrow valleys of the Scandinavian lands did not tempt men to agriculture. On the other hand, the sea invited them to voyage forth and seek adventures on its waters. The Northmen, therefore, had become bold sailors, and in their long, many-oared ships They now dared the storms of heaven and the wrath of man, to sail wherever there was booty to be had, or glory to be gained. Even in Charlemagne's time the Northmen had begun to trouble the southern lands. One day, while Charlemagne tarried in a city of southern Gaul, says an old writer, a few Scandinavian boats came to plunder even within the harbor of the city. Some thought at first that they were Jewish merchants. Others believed that they were from northern Africa, or were traders from Brittany. But Charlemagne recognized them by the fleetness of their ships. "These are not merchants," he said, "but cruel enemies." When the ships were pursued, they quickly disappeared. Then the emperor, rising from the table where he sat, went to the window which looked towards the east, and remained there a long time, his eyes filled with tears. No one ventured to question him, but at last he said, "Do you know, my faithful friends, why I weep so bitterly? It is not because I fear that these men should annoy me by their wretched acts of piracy. But I am deeply afflicted because during my lifetime they have come so near these shores, and I am tormented by a great grief when I think of the woes they will inflict upon my successors and the whole nation." Before Charlemagne was dead, indeed, these hardy wanderers began to fulfill his prophecy, and after he was gone the evil increased rapidly. Now the Viking ships came by scores and hundreds, where before they had come singly and in dozens. The whole of Christendom suffered from them. They plundered the shores alike of Germany, France, England, Scotland, Ireland, Spain, and Italy. With their light vessels they would enter the river mouths, and row as far into the heart of the country as they could. Then they would seize horses, and on these ride far and wide. They loved most of all to attack the churches and monasteries. They cared nothing for the Christian God, for they were still heathen, and in the churches were rich gold and silver vessels, and fine embroidered cloths. It was easier also to capture a church or a monastery than it was a castle, for the priests and monks were not fighting men. And if any resisted these fierce heathen, they were pierced with arrows, or cloven with their swords. One of the most famous Vikings was named Hastings. Some say that he was not a Northman at all, but a French peasant who had joined the sea rovers. At all events, he was very strong, brave, and cunning, and became one of their most famous leaders. We first meet with him while Louis the Pious was king. For nearly 50 years after this he was busy plundering towns and wasting the country in different lands. Now we find him in France. Now he is in Frisia, just north of France. Now he is in England. Now he is on the shores of Spain. In one voyage Hastings sailed around the Spanish peninsula and entered the Mediterranean Sea. There he plundered southern France, Africa, and Italy. He wished especially to plunder Rome, as Alaric and the Vandal king had done before him, but he knew more about fighting than he did about geography. On the coast of Italy, north of Rome, lay a little city called Luna, and Hastings mistook its marble palaces and churches for the buildings of Rome. Even the walls of Luna, however, were too strong to be taken by force, so he was obliged to use a trick. He sent a messenger into the city saying that he had not come to make war, but was dying, and wished to be baptized a Christian. The bishop and rulers of the city were pleased at this, and Hastings was baptized as he wished. Then the next day word was brought from the ships that their leader was dead, and they wished him to be buried in the church of the city. There seemed no harm in this request, so the rulers gave their consent. Hastings, with his weapons lying by his side, was brought within the walls, and with him came some of his best warriors, as mourners. While the people of the city went with the funeral party to the church, the rest of the Northmen landed from their ships and slipped through the unguarded gate. Then Hastings suddenly seized his weapons and sprang from the couch where he lay. At once his followers fell upon the people, and in this way the town was soon won. At first the Northmen came only during the summer season, sailing home when the winter storms were due. Before long, however, they began to spend the winter also in Christian lands. They would seize upon an island lying off the coast at a river's mouth, and from this as headquarters they would go forth at all times of the year to ravage the land. For many years this prayer was regularly used in the churches. "From the fury of the Northmen, good Lord, deliver us." The struggle lasted for a long time. In France, within 50 years after Charlemagne's death, Paris had fallen 3 times. At first the weak kings tried to buy off the Northmen with gifts of money, but such gifts only made them greedy for more, and payment had to be made again and again. Then the nobles and the cities took defense into their own hands. In addition to the castles which the nobles were building, the cities began to fortify bridges over the rivers, so that they could keep the pirate ships from ascending the streams. The most famous struggle of all came at Paris in the year 886. This city was not yet the capital of France, but its situation already made it important. It was built on a low island in the Seine, with a fortified bridge connecting it with each bank. When the Northmen came up the river in that year, the governor of the city, Count Odo, and the bishop encouraged the people to resist. The Viking ships numbered 700, and they carried an army of 40,000 men. But for 11 months the city held out, and in spite of the weakness and cowardice of the king, the Northmen at last were obliged to withdraw. The family of this Count Odo had already won great honor in warring against the Northmen. For his father, Robert the Strong, had fallen, after many victories, fighting against the pirate Hastings. The brave defense of Paris now made Odo more powerful than ever, and men began to think how much worthier he was of the crown than the weak Carolingians. So the cowardly king who was then ruling was set aside, and Count Odo was chosen king. It was too soon, however, for his family to get the throne permanently. Nevertheless, the crown did pass at last in the year 987 to a member of his family, and from that date, for more than 800 years, all the kings of France were numbered among his descendants. 25 years after the great siege of Paris, a band of Northmen secured such a footing in France that it was never possible afterwards to drive them forth. Their leader was a man of enormous size, strength, and courage. His name was Rolf, or Rollo, and they called him the Ganger, which meant the Walker. Like Hastings, he was for nearly 50 years a sea king, plundering Frisia, England, Scotland, and France. At the great siege of Paris he was one of the chiefs. Unlike Hastings, however, Rolf was something more than a mere pirate and robber. When he captured a town he strengthened its walls and rebuilt its churches, and sought to rule over it as a conquering prince. In this way he came to possess a number of towns which lay north and south of the mouth of the river Seine. At last, in the year 911, he secured a grant from the King of France to a wide stretch of country in that region with the title of Duke. This grant was made on 3 conditions. First, he must settle his Northmen there, and leave the rest of the country at peace. Second, he must become a Christian, and third, he must do homage to the French king as his feudal lord. This last condition was very distasteful to Duke Rolf, and he could scarcely be induced to place his hands between the hands of the king as was required. When he was told to kneel down and kiss the foot of the king, as was the custom, he refused, and calling one of his followers, commanded him to do it. This bold Northman, however, had no more liking for the deed than his chief, and when he raised the king's foot to touch it to his lips, he toppled the king over on his back. In Normandy, as his land was called, Duke Rolf speedily showed that he was as good a ruler as he was a fighter. His followers settled down quietly under his stern rule, and became landlords and cultivators of the soil. Before he died, it is said that gold rings could be hung on the limbs of the trees, and no one would touch them. The Northmen learned rapidly in other ways too. They followed the lead of their duke in being baptized, and soon all were Christians. They also laid aside their old speech and law, and in less than 100 years the fierce sea rovers had become as good Frenchmen, in speech and everything else, as could be found in the kingdom. About the only thing to mark the difference between these Normans, as they were called, and the rest of the French, was their greater energy, their skill in governing, and their fondness for the sea and adventure. Proof that they had not lost their energy or military skill was given in events which took place in the 11th century. Within a little more than 100 years after Duke Rolf and his followers were established in France, their descendants began to send forth new bands of conquerors. By accident their attention was turned to Sicily and the southern part of Italy. Soon the greater part of these lands was conquered from the Greeks and Saracens, and a Norman kingdom was established there, called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. About the same time the Normans conquered England also. The old Northmen, or Danes as they were called in England, had conquered the northern half of that country nearly 200 years before. But the great English king, Alfred, and after him his son and grandsons, fought so bravely against the invaders that the land was gradually reconquered. Then, after a time, a new swarm of Danes had come as an organized and powerful army, and for a while the Danish king, Canute, ruled over all England, together with Norway and Denmark. But after his death, and the death of his two sons, the English once more had a king of their own, named Edward the Confessor. This king died in the year 1066, and at once William, the Duke of Normandy, gathered together an army to conquer England. He claimed that King Edward had promised him the throne, and also that King Harold, who had taken Edward's place, had sworn never to become king. So, with a great army of Normans and Frenchmen, and a banner blessed by the Pope, William landed on the shores of England. At Senlac, or Hastings, not far from the place where they landed, the Normans found King Harold and his Englishmen awaiting them. There the great battle took place. For a while it looked as though the Normans would be defeated, but Duke William ordered his men to pretend to flee, in order to draw the English from their strong position. This move succeeded in part, but still the battle went on. At last Harold was struck in the eye, and slain by an arrow shot up into the air, and the Normans won the battle. After this William soon got possession of all England. He was known as William the Conqueror, and became the founder of the line of kings and queens who have ruled that country down to the present day. This is not nearly all of the great deeds the Northmen and their descendants performed at this time, but we can only mention a few of the others. As every American boy and girl knows, the Northmen settled Iceland and Greenland, and discovered America long before Columbus was born. Twice bands of them attacked the city of Constantinople, and after that they entered the service of the Greek emperor, and for centuries made up his faithful bodyguard. In the far north they made settlements in Russia, and gave a line of rulers to the great Russian Empire. And when the Crusaders set out to win Jerusalem from the infidels, the Normans of France, England, and Sicily took the leading part in these movements also. These old Northmen were truly a wonderful people, and their coming into the Christian lands did much to make the southern nations stronger and more energetic than they would otherwise have been. End of chapter 10. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 24th, 2007, in Oceanside, California. The Story of the Middle Ages, Chapter 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. The Story of the Middle Ages by Samuel B. Harding. Chapter 11. The First Crusade. The period of the Crusades lasts from the year 1095 to the year 1270. In the great movement included between these dates we find, for the first time, practically the whole of Europe acting together for one end. And it was not only the rulers who were concerned. Priests and kings, nobles, townsmen and peasants alike took arms against the infidel. The story of the Crusades, therefore, is one of the most important and interesting parts of medieval history. Nothing can better show what the Middle Ages were like, and nothing helped more than they did to bring the Middle Ages to their end. The object of this movement was to bring Palestine, where Christ had lived and died, again under the rule of Christians. Until the Arabs began their conquests in the 7th century, the land had been ruled by the Eastern emperors. Even after the religion of Mohammed was established side by side with that of Christ, the Christians did not at first feel so badly about it. They were too busy at home, fighting Northmen and Hungarians, and settling the institutions under which they were to live, to give much attention to things so far away. Besides, the Arabs respected the holy places of the Christians, and allowed pilgrims to Jerusalem to come and go without harm or hindrance. But about 30 years before William the Norman conquered England, a new race appeared in the East. The Turks, who were a rude, fierce people from Central Asia, of close kin to the old Huns, conquered the Arabs, and the treatment of the Christian was thenceforth very different. The Turks were Mohammedans also, but they did not have the same respect for the religion of the Jews and Christians that the Arabs did. Besides, they were fiercer and more bloodthirsty, and in a short time they won from the Eastern Empire lands which the Arabs had never been able to conquer. Even Constantinople was not safe from them. "From Jerusalem to the Aegean Sea," wrote the Emperor of the East to a Western ruler, "the Turkish hordes have mastered all. Their galleys sweep the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and threaten the imperial city itself." In the West, too, quieter times had now come, and rulers and people could turn their attention abroad. Finally, there was now more enthusiasm for religion among all classes, so when pilgrims returned from Jerusalem, telling of outrages committed against Christian persons and against Christian holy places, it was felt to be a shame that this thing should be. When, therefore, the Emperor of the East wrote to the Pope asking for aid against the Turks, the people of the West were in a mood to grant it. At a great council held at Clermont, in France, in the year 1095, Pope Urban II laid the matter before the clergy and princes. Most of those present were French, and Urban, who was himself a Frenchman, spoke to them in their own tongue. He told them of the danger to Constantinople and of the sad state of Jerusalem, while the Western peoples were quarreling and fighting among themselves. In all that region, he said, Christians had been led off into slavery, their homes laid waste, and their churches overthrown. Then he appealed to his hearers to remember Charlemagne and the victories which he was believed to have won over the Arabs, and urged them to begin anew the war with the Mohammedans. "Christ himself," he cried, "will be your leader when you fight for Jerusalem. Let your quarrels cease, and turn your arms against the accursed Turks. In this way you will return home victorious, and laden with the wealth of your foes, or, if you fall in battle, you will receive an everlasting reward." To this appeal the council, with one accord, made answer, "It is the will of God! It is the will of God!" From all sides they hastened to give in their names for the holy war. Each person promising to go was given a cross of red cloth, which he was to wear upon his breast going to the Holy Land, and on his back returning. To those who took the cross, the name Crusaders was given, from the Latin word which means cross. The winter following the council was spent in getting ready. All classes showed the greatest zeal. Preachers went about among the people calling upon rich and poor, noble and peasant alike, to help free the Holy Land, and whole villages, towns, and cities were emptied of their inhabitants to join the Crusade. Many sold all they had to get the means to go, and thieves, robbers, and wicked men of all kinds promised to leave their wickedness and aid in rescuing the tomb of Christ Jesus from the infidels. The time set for the starting of the Crusade was the early summer of the year 1096. But the common people could not wait so long. Under a monk named Peter the Hermit and a poor knight called Walter the Penniless, great companies from Germany and France set out before that time. They had almost no money, they were unorganized, and there was no discipline or obedience in the multitude. The route which they took was down the river Danube, through the kingdoms of the Hungarians and Bulgarians, and so to Constantinople. Few of the people or their leaders had any idea of the distance, and as each new city came in sight, many cried out, "Is this Constantinople?" In Hungary and Bulgaria the people attacked them because they were forced to plunder the country as they passed through, and many were slain. When they reached Constantinople, some of the unruly company set fire to buildings near the city, while others stripped off sheets of lead from the roofs of churches to sell them to Greek merchants. The emperor hastened to get rid of his unwelcome guests by sending them across into Asia Minor. There, within a few months, Walter and most of his followers were slain by the Turks, and the expedition came to a sorrowful end. Meanwhile the princes from France, Germany, and Italy were making ready their expeditions. While the Norman chiefs of southern Italy were engaged in one of their many wars, a messenger came to them with the news that countless warriors of France had started on the way to Jerusalem, and invited them to join the expedition. "What are their weapons? What their badge? What their war cry?" asked one of the Normans. "Our weapons," replied the messenger, "are those best suited to war. Our badge, the cross of Christ. Our war cry, 'It is the will of God! It is the will of God!'" When he heard these words, the Norman tore from his shoulders the costly cloak, and with his own hands he made crosses from it for all who would follow him to the Holy Land. There he became one of the most famous and renowned of the Crusaders, and his followers showed that they could be as brave, as enterprising, and as skillful in fighting for the Holy Land as they had been before in fighting for lands and goods in France, in England, and in Italy. The Crusaders set out at last in 5 different companies. The first started in August, 1096. The last did not join the others, near Constantinople, until the next summer. The companies were made up of trained and armed knights, with chosen leaders, who had made many preparations for the expedition. They did not suffer so severely, therefore, as did the poor ignorant people under Walter the Penniless. Still they encountered many hardships. It was already winter when the men of South France toiled over the mountains near Constantinople. "For 3 weeks," writes one of their number, "we saw neither bird nor beast. For almost 40 days did we struggle on through mists so thick that we could actually feel them and brush them aside with a motion of the hand." At last this stage of their journey came to an end, and the Crusaders arrived at Constantinople. In the lands north of the Alps there were at that time none of the vast and richly ornamented churches and other buildings which later arose. All was poor and lacking in stateliness and beauty. Constantinople, however, was the most beautiful city in the world, so the sight of it filled the Crusaders with awe and admiration. "Oh, how great a city it is!" wrote one of their number. "How noble and beautiful! What wondrously wrought monasteries and palaces are therein! What marvels everywhere in street and square! It would be tedious to recite its wealth in all precious things, in gold and silver, in cloaks of many shapes, and saintly relics. For to this place ships bring all things that man may require. Now that these sturdy warriors of the West were actually at Constantinople, the Greek emperor began to fear lest they might prove more troublesome to his empire than the Turks themselves. "Some of the Crusaders," wrote the emperor's daughter, "were guileless men and women marching in all simplicity to worship at the tomb of Christ, but there were others of a more wicked kind. Such men had but one object, and this was to get possession of the emperor's capital." After much suspicion on both sides and many disputes, the emperor got the Franks, as the Crusaders were called, safely away from the city and over into Asia Minor. There at last they met the Turks. At first the latter rushed joyously into battle, dragging ropes with which to bind the Christians captive, but soon they found that the Franks were more than a match for them. Nicaea, the city where Constantine held the first church council, was soon taken, and the Crusaders then pressed on to other and greater victories. Letter writing was not nearly so common in those days as it is now, but some of the Crusaders wrote letters home telling of their deeds. A few of these have come down to us across the centuries, and in order that you may learn what the Crusaders were thinking and feeling, as well as what they were doing, one of them is given here. The writer was a rich and powerful noble, and the letter was written while the army was laying siege, with battering rams and siege towers, to the strongly walled city of Antioch. Count Stephen to Adele, his sweetest and most amiable wife, to his dear children, and to all his vassals of all ranks, his greeting and blessing. You may be very sure, dearest, that the messenger, whom I send to give you pleasure, left me before Antioch safe and unharmed, and through God's grace in the greatest prosperity. Already at that time we had been continuously advancing for 23 weeks toward the home of our Lord Jesus. You may know for certain, my beloved, that of gold, silver, and many other kinds of riches, I now have twice as much as your love had wished for me when I left you. For all our princes, with the common consent of the whole army, and against my own wishes, have made me, up to the present time, the leader, chief, and director of their whole expedition. You have certainly heard that, after the capture of the city of Nicaea, we fought a great battle with the faithless Turks, and by God's aid conquered them. Next we conquered for the Lord all Romania, and afterwards Cappadocia. Thence, continually following the wicked Turks, we drove them through the midst of Armenia as far as the great river Euphrates. Having left all their baggage and beasts of burden on the bank, they fled across the river into Arabia. Some of the bolder of the Turkish soldiers, however, entered Syria, and hastened by forced marches night and day to enter the royal city of Antioch before our approach. The whole army of God, learning this, gave due praise and thanks to the all-powerful Lord. Hastening with great joy to Antioch, we besieged it, and had many conflicts there with the Turks. 7 times we fought, with the fiercest courage and under the leadership of Christ, against the citizens of Antioch and the innumerable troops which were coming to its aid. In all these 7 battles, by the aid of the Lord God, we conquered and assuredly killed an innumerable host of them. In those battles, indeed, and in very many attacks made upon the city, many of our brethren and followers were killed, and their souls were borne to the joys of paradise. In fighting against these enemies of God and of our own, we have by God's grace endured many sufferings and innumerable evils up to the present time. Many have already exhausted all their resources in this very holy expedition. Very many of our Franks, indeed, would have met death from starvation if the mercy of God and our money had not helped them. Before the city of Antioch, and indeed throughout the whole winter, we suffered for our Lord Christ from excessive cold and great torrents of rain. What some say about the impossibility of bearing the heat of the sun throughout Syria is untrue, for the winter here is very similar to our winter in the west. When the Emir of Antioch, that is, its prince and lord, perceived that he was hard pressed by us, he sent his son to the prince who holds Jerusalem, and to the prince of Damascus, and to 3 other princes. These 5 emirs, with 12,000 picked Turkish horsemen, suddenly came to aid the inhabitants of Antioch. We, indeed, ignorant of this, had sent many of our soldiers away to the cities and fortresses, for there are 165 cities and fortresses throughout Syria, which are in our power. But a little before they reached the city, we attacked them at 3 leagues' distance, with 700 soldiers. God surely fought for us against them, for on that day we conquered them and killed an innumerable multitude, and we carried back to the army more than 200 of their heads, in order that the people might rejoice on that account. These things which I write to you are only a few, dearest, of the many deeds which we have done. And because I am not able to tell you, dearest, what is in my mind, I charge you to do right, to carefully watch over your land, to do your duty as you ought to your children and your vassals. You will certainly see me just as soon as I can possibly return to you. Farewell. The capture of Antioch was the hardest task that the Crusaders had to perform, and it was not until 3 months later that the city was finally safe in their hands. Many of the Crusaders became discouraged meanwhile and started home. At this trying time, a priest declared that it had been revealed to him in a dream, thrice repeated, that the head of the spear which had pierced our Lord's side lay buried near one of the altars of a church near by, and it was further revealed, he said, that if this was found, and borne at the head of the army, victory would surely follow. After long search and much prayer and fasting, the Holy Lance was found. Then there was great joy, and new courage among the Christians, and when next they marched against the Turks, the Crusaders fought more fiercely than ever. "Thanks to the Lord's lance," writes one of their number, "none of us were wounded, no, not so much as by an arrow. I, who speak these things, saw them for myself, since I was bearing the Lord's lance." The Crusaders continued to fight valiantly until Antioch was theirs, and the armies which had marched to its relief were defeated and scattered. The Crusaders were now free to march on to Jerusalem. There men and animals suffered much from lack of food and water. Many, an old writer says, lay near the dried-up springs, unable to utter a cry because of the dryness of their tongues, and there they remained with open mouths and hands stretched out to those whom they saw had water. Again the priests saw visions, and it was promised to the Crusaders that if the army marched barefoot around the city for 9 days, the city would fall. So a procession was formed, and the Crusaders marched around the city, with white-robed priests and bishops, cross in hand, at their head, chanting hymns and praying as they went. As the procession passed by, the Mohammedans mocked at them from the walls, and some beat a cross, crying out, "Look, Franks, it is the Holy Cross on which your Christ was slain." After this the chiefs ordered an attack on the city from 2 sides. The Mohammedans were now beaten back from the walls by the showers of stones thrown by the hurling machines, while blazing arrows carried fire to the roofs of the buildings in the city. Battering rams, too, were at work breaking great holes in the solid walls, and scaling ladders were placed, by which the Christians swarmed over the ramparts. So, at last, the city fell. Jerusalem, the holy Jerusalem, which held the tomb of Christ, was now once more in the hands of the Christians. But what a terrible day was that! How little of the meek and just spirit of Christ did his followers show! "When our men had taken the city with its walls and towers," writes one of the Crusaders, "there were things wondrous to be seen, for some of the enemy, and this is a small matter, were deprived of their heads, others, riddled through with arrows, were forced to leap down from the towers, and others, after long torture, were burned in the flames. In all the streets and squares there were to be seen piles of heads and hands and feet, and along the public ways foot and horse alike made passage over the bodies of the slain. In this way the Crusaders fulfilled their vow to wrest the Holy Sepulchre from the infidel. How many hundreds of thousands of lives, both Christian and Mohammedan, were lost to gain this end! What agonies of battle, what sufferings on the way, what numbers of women made widows, and children left fatherless! And all this that the tomb of Christ might not remain in the hands of a people who did not accept his religion. How pityingly the Christ must have looked down upon this struggle, with his mild, sweet eyes! How far away this bloodshed and war seems from the teachings of him whose birth was heralded by the angel's cry, "Peace on earth, good will towards men." "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy," said Christ. But this teaching, alas, the Crusaders seemed not to know. End of chapter 11. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 25th, 2007, in Oceanside, California. The Story of the Middle Ages, Chapter 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg. The Story of the Middle Ages by Samuel B. Harding. Chapter 12. Later Crusades. After the Holy Land was won, a government had to be organized to prevent the land from slipping back into the hands of the infidels. The Crusaders knew only one way to rule a land, namely, the feudal way. That was the way Western Europe was ruled, so that was the form of government set up in Palestine. The land was divided into a number of fiefs, and each of these was given to a crusading chief. In each fief the feudal law and a feudal government was then introduced. Jerusalem, with the country about, was formed into the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, and was given to Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the most famous of the Crusaders. The rest of the land was formed into 3 principalities, each with its own feudal head, and with many vassal crusaders. The peasants who tilled the soil before the Crusaders came were not driven off. They had long been Christians, though they worshipped more like the Greeks than like the Latins. The only difference in their position was that now they were to pay rent and taxes to Christian masters, and not to Turks and Saracens. As soon as Jerusalem had fallen, most of the Crusaders began to make preparations for returning home. Soon Godfrey and his fellow rulers were left with mere handfuls of men to resist the attacks of the Mohammedans. If the latter had been united, they could easily at this time have driven the Franks into the sea. But the Mohammedans were quarreling among themselves, and besides had learned to fear the mail-clad Franks. So the Christians were given time to prepare their defense. Huge castles were everywhere built to protect the lands they had won. New companies of Crusaders, too, were constantly arriving to take the place of those who had returned home, and merchants from the Italian cities were coming to settle for the purpose of carrying on trade. Soon, too, 3 special orders of knights were formed to protect the Holy Land and care for the Christians. The first of these was the Knights of the Hospital, or the Knights of St. John. Its chief purpose was to care for and protect sick pilgrims. The second was the Order of the Temple, or Knights Templar. They got their name because their headquarters were in the Temple at Jerusalem. The third was the Order of the Teutonic Knights, which received its name because its members were Germans, while the members of the other orders were mostly French. The members of these orders were both monks and knights. They were bound, like monks, by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they were also knights engaged in a perpetual crusade against the infidel. The Hospitallers wore a white cross on a black mantle. the Templars a red cross on a white mantle, and the Teutonic Knights a black cross on a mantle of white. These military orders became very powerful and wealthy, and helped a great deal to keep the Holy Land in the hands of the Christians. For nearly half a century after Jerusalem was recovered, there was no very great danger to the rule of the Franks. Then all Europe was startled by the news that one of the 4 Christian principalities had been conquered by the Saracens, and the Christians put to the sword. At once there was great fear lest the other states should fall also, and preparations were made for sending out a large number of crusaders to their assistance. This expedition started in the year 1147 and is known as the Second Crusade. The kings of 2 of the leading countries of Europe, Conrad III of Germany and Louis VII of France, led the forces. Their armies took the same route, down the river Danube and across to Constantinople, that the First Crusade had followed. Again there was terrible suffering on the way. The German army was almost entirely destroyed in Asia Minor, and although the French reached Palestine in safety, very little was accomplished in the way of strengthening the Christians there. After the failure of this crusade, there was no great change for 40 years. Twice a year, in the spring and autumn, a number of vessels would sail from the cities of Italy and southern France, carrying pilgrims and adventurers to Palestine. In this way the strength of the Christian states was kept up, in spite of the number who were constantly returning. Then, towards the end of the period, rumors began to come of a great Mohammedan leader who had arisen in Egypt and was threatening Palestine with new danger. He was called Saladin, and was one of the greatest rulers the Mohammedans ever had. He was foremost in battle, and wise and far-sighted in council. When he was victorious he dealt generously with his enemies, and when defeated he was never cast down. He was ever simple in his habits, just and upright in his dealings, and true to his promises. He was, in short, as chivalrous a warrior, and as sincere a believer in his faith, as any of the Christian knights against whom he fought. For Saladin, as well as for the Crusaders, the war for Palestine was a holy war, and soon his power was grown so great that he could attack them from all sides. "So great is the multitude of the Saracens and Turks," wrote one of the Crusaders in speaking of his armies, "that from the city of Tyre, which they are besieging, they cover the face of the earth as far as Jerusalem, like an innumerable army of ants." When the Christians marched out to battle, they were overthrown with terrible slaughter, and the King of Jerusalem and the Grand Master of the Templars were among the captives taken. 3 months after this, Saladin laid siege to Jerusalem itself. For 2 weeks only the city held out. At the end of that time it was forced to sue for peace. The mercy which Saladin now showed to the conquered Christians was in strange contrast to the cruelty which the Crusaders had displayed when the city fell into their hands. There was no slaughter such as had occurred 90 years before, and the greater number of the defeated party were allowed to go free on paying a ransom. But the crosses on the churches were torn down, the bells were destroyed, and the churches themselves were changed into Mohammedan mosques. Once more the Holy Land was in the hands of the unbeliever. When news of these events reached Europe it caused great excitement. The 3 most powerful rulers, Frederick of Germany, Philip of France, and Richard the Lion-Hearted of England, took the cross, and in the years 1189 and 1190 they led forth their followers to the Third Crusade. The Emperor Frederick of Germany, who was called Barbarossa on account of his red beard, had been one of those who followed King Conrad in the Second Crusade. Now, although he was 70 years old, he was the first to start on the third. He led his army by the old land route, but his forces were better organized, and there was not so much hardship as there had been before. Except for one battle which they had to fight with the Greek emperor, all went well until the army reached Asia Minor. There, alas, the old emperor was drowned while swimming a river one hot day to refresh himself and shorten his way. After that the German army went to pieces, and most of its members lost their lives in the mountains and deserts of Asia Minor, or were cut down by Turkish soldiers. In Germany the people refused to believe that their king was dead. Long after this, stories were told of the good Barbarossa, who slept from year to year in a rocky cavern high up on a lonely mountainside, with his head resting on his hand, and his long red beard grown round the granite blocks by his side. There, the people said, he lay sleeping throughout the ages, but when the ravens should cease to fly about the mountain, the emperor would wake to punish the wicked and bring back the golden age to the world. When at last Philip of France and Richard of England were ready, they took ship to avoid the hardships of the journey by land. From the beginning, however, things went wrong. Richard and Philip were very jealous of each other and could not get along together. Philip was only half-hearted in the Crusade and longed to be back in France, while Richard allowed himself to be turned aside for a while to other things. When they reached the Holy Land, they found the Christians laying siege to Acre, one of the seaports near Jerusalem. The siege had already lasted more than a year, and for several months longer it dragged on. It was a dreary time for the Christians. "The Lord is not in the camp," wrote one of their number. "There is none that doeth good. The leaders strive with one another, while the lesser folk starve, and have none to help. The Turks are persistent in attack, while our knights skulk within their tents. The strength of Saladin increases daily, but daily does our army wither away." At last Acre was taken, mainly through the skill and daring of King Richard, who was one of the best warriors of that day, and knew well how to use the battering rams, stone throwers, movable towers, and other military engines to batter down walls and take cities. Philip was already weary of the Crusade, and soon after returned to France. Richard remained for more than a year longer. In this time he won some military successes, but he could not take Jerusalem. Finally news came to Richard from England that his brother John was plotting to make himself king. Richard was now obliged to return home. The only advantage he had gained for the Christians was a truce for 3 years, permitting pilgrims to go to the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem without hindrance. Before he left, Richard warned Saladin that he would return to renew the war, but he never did. On his way home he was shipwrecked, and was obliged to pass by land through Germany. There he was recognized by his enemies, and kept prisoner till he paid a heavy ransom. Then, after his release, he found himself engaged in troubles with his brother John, and in war with King Philip, and at last, in the year 1199, he died from an arrow wound while fighting in France. The remaining Crusades are not of so much importance as the first and the third. On the fourth Crusade the Crusaders were persuaded by the Venetians to attack the Christian city of Constantinople. In this way the Greek Empire passed for 50 years into the hands of the Latin Christians. As a result of the fifth Crusade, Jerusalem was recovered for a while, but this was accomplished through a treaty, and not as the result of victories won by arms. The sixth Crusade was led by the good King St. Louis of France. The Crusaders now sought to attack the Saracens in Egypt, but they were defeated, and the French king himself was captured and forced to pay a heavy ransom. The last Crusade was the seventh, which was also led by St. Louis of France. Now the Crusaders attacked the Saracens in Tunis. Again the Crusade was a failure, and this time the French king lost his life through a sickness which broke out in the army. After this, for more than a century, popes and kings talked of Crusades and raised taxes and made preparations for them. But though they fought the heathen in Prussia and the Mohammedans in Spain and in Hungary, no more Crusades went to the Holy Land to win the sepulchre of Christ from the infidel. Men no longer thought that this was so important as it had once seemed to them, and no doubt they were right. It doesn't make so much difference who rules the land where Christ lived and died. The great question is whether Christ lives and rules in the hearts and lives of those who follow him. Although the Crusades failed in what they were intended to accomplish, they had some very important results. For nearly 200 years men were going and coming in great number to and from the Holy Land, seeing strange countries and strange peoples, and learning new customs. Before the Crusades each district lived by itself, and its inhabitants scarcely ever heard of the rest of the world. During the Crusades this separation was broken down, and people from all parts of Christendom met together. In this way men came to learn more of the world, and of the people who dwelt in it, and their minds were broadened by this knowledge. Never after the Crusades, as a result, was the life of man quite so dark, so dreary, and so narrow as it had been before. From this time on, the Middle Ages gradually changed their character. For influences were now at work to bring this period to an end, and bring about the beginning of modern times. End of chapter 12. Read by Kara Schallenberg on March 26, 2007, in Oceanside, California.